Okay, so going to get into this one. Obviously, this is deliberately trying to emulate some early 90s death metal, where I look fondly back on those records and the production on them, and I think they sound great. But by today's standards, they sound kind of like mushy and muddy and that sort of stuff. I think there's a certain charm to it, and I was definitely trying to sort of balance between that old school sound and getting a bit more clarity in there. Obviously, modern recording techniques have come a long way since. Basically, I have a lot of respect for Scott Burns and all these old school recordings, so I'm just trying to emulate that sound. And he was so ahead of his time with a lot of that stuff, especially some of the drum triggering. I think a lot of metal bands, especially the death metal bands these days, sort of overlook the fact that triggers were used on all those records, and people are trying to make death metal records without using samples. Even though if you listen to the kicks on, any of that stuff, like Tomb of the Mutilated, fully sample replaced kick drums, by the sound of it. At least there's definitely samples in there on most of those records, if you listen to like even Death, Leprosy, that kind of thing. So this one in particular, going for a deliberate kind of first Deicide record thing with a bit of Morbid Angel. And for the guitar tone, went for something that I wouldn't normally do. Super scooped, kind of muddy and mushy sounding, but that's the whole thing. Going to start off this time looking at the drums. So I think it was originally the old school death metal preset from Ultimate Heavy Drums. And it sounds like this. So the kick drum here, I think the Tama 22 Resonant Head Off. I don't know if that's the one that comes with this preset as standard. Maybe it is. I don't know if I changed that. The snare is this Ludwig 402 in the lower tuning out of the two. And that just has like a classic late 80s, early 90s snare sound. Now, a lot of those early death metal records, some of them had a bit more of a cranked snare sound. If you think about like Obituary, they always had a bit more like crack and pop to the snare. Same with like some of the Cannibal Corpse stuff, a little bit higher tuned, but a lot of it was, some of the Morbid Angel and Deicide stuff, and like Sepultura Arise definitely had a very similar sound to that. So for the snare, I'm boosting the overhead a little bit more, taking some of the high end off, and ton of reverb, 51%, which is higher than I normally get on this. 47% on the toms, around that. A lot of those, early 90s, late 80s records had so much reverb. If you listen to like Leprosy by Death, that snare is just like, very wet and sound sample replaced. So not really much going on there. It's kind of just the preset as it comes. I don't know if I took some of the high end off in the preset or if I tweaked it at all, but you can look at my settings here. At what I've done. So I'm pretty sure I just left the preset as it is, but I haven't checked this session out in a while. So that's how the drums sound. Now let's check out the guitars. For them, I was using Amp Hub and trying something a bit different. So this is how they sound. I think I used my Michael Wilton guitar for this with Fishman's. Bands were using, EMGs back then. I don't know how many of the Morrisound records were done with EMGs. Maybe Sepultura Arise, they might have had EMGs. Actually, I'm using the Triple X. There you go. So I'm using the Triple X with these settings. Cab. Interesting. Mesa Boogie. So that's not very Morrisound. So admittedly, the Triple X is a newer amp, and no one was using. I think they were just using Marshall cabs back then. Let's check out the other guitar. I haven't opened this session in a while, so see what's going on. Yep, same again. Cool. So the EQ is going to be pretty drastic on these, I think, to get them to sound the way they are. Got tons of EQ layered up. So first bit of EQ. Scooping around some of the upper mids, because the Morrisound stuff's normally, you know, doesn't have a lot of upper mids. It's really scooped between like 800 to 2K usually. Sort of doing some dynamic EQ there. And then amplified instrument processor. What we doing? Boosting at 3K by 7 dB. And cutting there at 7K. Quite a narrow notch. And then what we're pulling out, nearly minus 20, so minus 18 at sort of 940. So 950, scooping at 950, to me, every time I look at the Morrisound guitar tones, that seems to be like the Morrisound thing. So if I put this back in, mid-range, they don't want none of that in early 90s death metal. And then cutting a little bit at like 290-ish. So a bit of soothe. Now this is a plugin obviously that's brand new, this type of stuff, but there would have been a natural sort of soothing to most of the stuff they were recording back then, just because of the fact that it was done to tape. Doing some C-port multi-band compression. I've got 2 instances of that because it's so out of hand. I've got reverb on the guitars, which I don't normally do, and I've completely forgot I put that on. Just trying to get a bit more vibe. I don't know how much of those guitar tones had reverb, but I think I was just playing around. And then, yeah, doing some notching out. I think I was A-Bing against the Deicide self-titled tone, so these notches I think were trying to emulate what I was seeing in FabFilter. So that EQ curve looks insane by modern standards. It's not something that I would typically want to go for, but having a huge scoop around here between 800 and 1K, very Morrisound. Yeah, and just more refining again, so tons of EQ on this. And let's hear how the guitars sound with no processing. Super dull sounding. I was definitely trying to go for like a solid state kind of tone with that one. And then bass, using nocturnal bass. Can have a look at the chain. Pro Q3. Fab filter. I do this to iron out the low end in particular. Then compress it. So I'm just using the DI sound from nocturnal bass. Dark glass. Pro Q3, limiter, more EQ, refining, some dynamic EQ there, and then last bit of EQ just to get it to sort of sit in the mix. So I've been going pretty crazy with EQ recently. It's not something that I always do, but I have done here. Let's check out, hopefully those guitars are sort of similar to where they were. So we can check out the master bus. Now I've pulled the master bus fader down just for the sake of the level of my mic versus the audio coming out of Cubase. And we can check that out. So some EQ up first, just removing below like 50 Hertz and down, the most minuscule boost, like shelf at 10K. And then this bus comp. Ratio 3, attack 30, release 0.1. Now, I don't know much about like Scott Burns's moves, what sort of EQs he used, that kind of stuff. This is just my sort of go-to master bus chain. This is taking, just shaving off a bit of the snare transient and just ducking the mix around the snare. So I've got this high pass filtered to like 80 Hertz as well. Fast attack and release, sort of like a nollie thing. And then this is just another tape saturation. This one comes in Cubase. I really like the sound of that one. Definitely has a more like old school sound to it. Flatline. I think that's only really kicking in on the harder snare hits, and we are currently on a blast beat, which is softer hits. Not going too aggressive with the master bus stuff here because those records weren't, you know, clipped to high heaven, so not doing it now either. Cool. So yeah, crazy having the guitars have a bit of reverb on them. Just having to play with this one, just a bit of fun. Definitely not the sort of stuff that I'd normally do in a mix, but was a lot of fun trying to recreate that sort of tone. Definitely trying to rip off some Altars of Madness, Morbid Angel there. Cool, I hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks for checking it out.